Is it a bad thing that the continuing collapse of the Russian Empire would be accelerated by the Putin regime falling due to the loss of Crimea? Number one, why is that a bad thing? When people say, oh my God, we don't want to do that, like, okay, why not? I mean, why is that a bad thing? Russia will never be a normal country until they are forced or they are freed from this empire led that benefits only a very small number of people. And in fact, I would advocate that we should be preparing, thinking, planning for what happens if.
This is a conversation with Ben Hodges, a retired 3-star general of the US Army, the former commander of the US Army Europe, and someone who spent more than 3 decades as a military officer and who achieved one of the highest posts in the US Armed Forces. In this interview, we discussed what the latest military aid package means for Ukraine and whether it is enough, why the West seems to prioritize avoiding escalation more than defeating Russia, whether NATO should send troops to Ukraine, how could Ukraine retake Crimea, or whether we should worry about the fall of Putin's regime. Thank you to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for the privilege.
I think a good way to start would be by looking at the recent aid package that has been approved, because in recent months, things seemed like they are looking increasingly bleak for Ukraine as it was running out of ammunition. And now the major aid package has been approved, but there are different opinions on what is it actually going to mean for Ukraine and how big of an impact it's going to have, since it is only a single package and it's probably not going to be enough to win the war. So now that we know that it has been approved, what do you expect to see on the battlefield in coming months and in the rest of the year with the aid that Ukraine will now be getting?
Well, you are certainly correct that this aid package alone is not going to win the war. And the fact that it took so long to get done was not only incredibly frustrating, it also created opportunity for Russian forces to start some movement, if you will, due to Ukrainian forces running out of ammunition. Now, of course, the United States is not alone here. I mean, there are other countries also that can and must be providing ammunition and capabilities. And I think, including your own president, has been active in looking for resources for Ukraine. First, strategic effect of the package is this is bad news for the Kremlin. The Russians do not have the ability, in my view, to knock Ukraine out of the war. They can only grind forward using precision weapons against civilian targets in Ukrainian cities, as well as attempt to overwhelm with Russian mass forces the Ukrainian defenders. And so the Kremlin's hope was that the West would quit, that we would turn our back on Ukraine and that we would not support them. So this finally approved aid package, I think, destroys that hope for the Kremlin that we would quit. On the actual battlefield itself, I think it's too early to tell exactly how it's going to be felt. I think some of the ATACMs that have been used recently, obviously that's a positive development. And the Department of Defense was leaning forward, ready to deliver things as quickly as the approval came through. But this is not going to happen in just one shipment. I mean, it's going to be happening, I think, over the coming weeks.
Personally, I didn't expect that in the end it would actually even get approved, because for a long time it looked like it will not. And I think from the Ukrainian position, it's very tricky because on one hand, the US aid is extremely important, but on the other one, it's not clear how reliable it actually is and how much of it they will see in the future, because it also might be the last package that they will ever get. So I wonder if you would be in the Ukrainian position, if you would be advising the Ukrainian leadership, what would be your strategy and how much would you feel that you can rely on the US aid for the future?
Well, of course, there's 3 or 4 aspects to this situation. Um, the Ukrainians, of course, need to, in terms of strategic communications, need to work with other partners to make sure that Americans realize this is in our interest that Ukraine is successful. So, I mean, the emphasis of um, advocacy has got to be based on strategic interests of the United States and of the West, about our own economic prosperity, about making sure that Russia's defeated in Ukraine so that there is no war between NATO and Russia. And of course, to effectively deter China. China needs to see that the U.S. is willing to do everything necessary to protect our values, respect for sovereignty, respect for freedom of navigation, respect for human rights, respect for international law. So it can't be about um, an emotional appeal because of the brave Ukrainian women and men, although that's true. That part is no longer compelling for billions of dollars of aid. So that would be one point I would make. Make the connection for Americans to realize why it's in our interest. And the same is true, by the way, for European citizens, voters, and taxpayers. I would look for every possibility to get others to, as Ukraine does, support from other countries that are indicating that they are ready to provide, and they are providing, whether it's Patriot or other missile defense systems, ammunition, etc. But Ukraine also has the responsibility to fix themselves. It's unbelievable to me that they have still not truly changed their personnel system to get the army to the size it needs to be. I know they just went through a big political debate to lower the conscription age from 27 to 25. I was astounded that it was ever at 27. I mean, most everybody else in Europe, as well as the U.S., starts at 18 or 19. I understand the concerns about losing an entire generation of young men, but we're talking about saving your country. And I think that Ukraine runs the risk of losing some external support if it appears that huge parts of their society are not willing to actually serve.
You've mentioned the ATACMS that were recently supplied to Ukraine and that were previously denied for quite a long time. And the denial, I think it's quite interesting, is part of what has been dubbed sort of an escalation management. This approach that took hold in the US and in some European countries that really puts the concerns over possible escalation in the first place, and that affects all our policy decisions. And I think it's worth talking about because so far it seems that all these worries about escalation that we had in the past turned out eventually to not be grounded in reality, because nothing ever actually happens after we break the red lines that we've previously imposed on ourselves. And I wonder, since you are one of the advocates against this approach, why do you think that this escalation management policy is still so strong, not just in the US, but in Europe as well? And how much of a detriment it is having on the war effort?
Well, I think it's a reflection of naivety, of that somehow Russia could be, managed somehow like the regulator on your heater, that you could just turn it a little bit one way or the other, and that Russia would respond to that. And it's a joke. There's zero evidence that ever works. What history shows is that Russia only respects strength. And so we are victims. We've allowed ourselves to become victims of their threats and of course, look, Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons. They clearly do not care how many innocent people they kill, including their own. So you can't just dismiss these threats, but the likelihood of them ever actually using a nuclear weapon is extremely low. There is no benefit for them to use a nuclear weapon. The biggest benefit for them is the threat that they might use it, because they see how we deter ourselves. So I think that the administration, and not only, but also Germany, the German government, and others have got to get past this. To use the combined strength that we have Not, and I don't mean just military. I'm talking about the diplomatic strength, the economic power that all of us have together. It dwarfs whatever Russia has, and we should stop being deterred by our own unfounded fear that Russia might somehow use a nuclear weapon. I think it's very, very unlikely. What is likely to happen is because we don't commit to helping Ukraine win, is that this war is just going to keep going and going and going. And while it may not be escalated, it will be elongated. It will go on longer than it should.
And I guess if that happens, the war of attrition, if it just keeps on continuing forever, does the time play in favor of Russia, or does it play in favor of us?
That's a fair question. I think Putin will keep going until he realizes he can't win. And right now, he doesn't see that. He believes that we will quit, that we don't have the will, and that our leaders are not able to make the case to the American people or the German people or the French or whoever to continue doing this. And so, as long as he believes that, then he'll continue to murder innocent Ukrainian citizens, continue to destroy Ukrainian uh, territory and infrastructure, because he doesn't care about his own losses. I mean, he is protected from sanctions as well as the economic impact of his terrible decisions. And so far, it doesn't look like Russian people are willing to put a stop to it. So until he uh, realizes that there's no way that Russia can win, that Russia is going to lose this war. And the first indicator will be when the president of the United States and the German Bundeskanzler say it is in our strategic interest, is our priority that Ukraine defeats Russia in Ukraine, and we're going to do everything necessary to make that happen. When he hears that, then he's going to know it's over.
It was quite interesting to see this escalation management approach. Also, after Emmanuel Macron, the French president, tried to bring up this idea of strategic ambiguity, and when he suggested that Western troops might be deployed to Ukraine in some capacity, and that was very quickly shut down by quite a number of NATO member states. And I wonder, in your view, what was your view on the whole debate? And even more so, do you think that we should send troops of NATO member states to Ukraine or consider that? And if so, what should be their goal? What should be their purpose there?
So I don't completely agree with the way you characterize what President Macron said. What he said was we should not take it off the table as a possibility, and I thought that was brilliant. I mean, make the Russians worry about what we might do instead of us always worrying about what they might do. Even if he never intends to send a single French soldier or sailor or airman into Ukraine, the fact that he's saying, well, we should not take that off the table. And that was not rejected by many. It was rejected immediately by the German Bundeskanzler, which is unfortunate because, but to be expected. However, I saw several other leaders who said, yeah, that is an important consideration. I thought it was a mistake when my president back in late 2021 said, no U.S. boots on the ground. Why would you say that? I mean, why would you tell the enemy what you won't do? I mean, that's a gift. So I like what President Macron said. Now, I personally am not against any of our actual capabilities going into Ukraine, but first, I would want to hear our civilian leadership explain the purpose. That's the key. It's easy to throw troops or airplanes or the Navy at a problem without actually explaining the objective. What is the strategic end state? And that's the first responsibility of our leaders, is to explain the strategic outcome we're trying to achieve, not the reverse, which is usually just to throw troops at it. So that would be my expectation. And if we're saying that our goal is that Ukraine wins this war, and we can provide some capabilities that will help with protection of civilian infrastructure or improve logistics or whatever, then I would absolutely support that. We had U.S. pilots and Royal Air Force pilots flying in support of Israel to help defeat this Iranian missile attack a couple of weeks ago. Israel has the best air defenses in the world. Why? I mean, if it was important enough for the U.S. to contribute to that, why are we not helping Ukraine protect its civilian population? And Ukraine does not have the best air defenses in the world. So I think this is something that I would absolutely support.
I guess the main argument against it is that if that would happen, if NATO troops or forces are in Ukraine in any capacity, there's always the risk that they might get in a direct confrontation with Russia or suffer casualties from Russians, and that would then lead to an escalation into a NATO Russia war, which no one wants.
Well, you're right, and the NATO Russia war is not necessary if we demonstrate that we're prepared for it. The last thing that Russia wants is a conflict with NATO, assuming that we act in unison and are at the level of readiness that we should be. I don't believe that it automatically leads to a Russia NATO conflict if you have U.S. or French or Czech troops that are in Ukraine helping with logistics, for example, or helping with air defense against um, uh, missiles coming in, for example. And by the way, you have U.S. troops at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev already. So there's already the possibility in all of our embassies that Americans or Czechs or Brits or Germans could be killed by a Russian missile. So um, I can see plenty of situations where it would be advisable to do this. But again, first and foremost, there has to be absolute clarity of purpose and a strategic outcome that we want to achieve. That is probably the most important thing my president can do, your president can do. What is the strategic outcome we're trying to achieve?
Let me take a quick break here from the conversation to tell you about my Patreon. I do these interviews in my free time because I enjoy them, but if you want to help me make more of them, consider becoming a supporter. In return, you will be able to ask my future guests your questions, get Patreon only episodes and bonus content, and watch all the interviews couple days early and without ads. You can go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics or use the link in the description to check it out. But whatever you do, thank you for watching. And now, back to the conversation. I guess to dig deeper on that, when President Biden was announcing the recent package, he sort of did state that, or he said that thanks to this package, Ukraine can stay in the fight, or it will keep Ukraine in the fight, which so far seems like that's the strategic goal of the US policy. I guess I don't know if you would agree with that assessment, and if that was true, if that you think that's a smart policy to have.
Yeah, I thought it was terrible. Why is the strategy keep Ukraine in the fight instead of we want Ukraine to win? I mean, the president has to explain what he means by this. Keep them in the fight for what? The Russians are not going to quit. I mean, unless I was completely wrong in what I said earlier, they're not going to stop, no matter how many casualties they have, because they don't give a damn about these unlucky troops that are getting slaughtered every day. They don't care. And as long as sanctions have holes in them, you know, he will keep doing that as long as he thinks that we're willing to quit. So the idea that our job or our priority is just to keep Ukraine in the fight, I think, is really short-sighted, poor strategic thinking. But it also comes from this excessive fear that Russia might somehow use a nuclear weapon, which I think is bad, is poor strategic thinking.
One last thing on the aid to Ukraine is there's recently been a discussion of patriots for Ukraine that a number of countries have and that Ukraine quite desperately needs. And so far it looks like Germany is the only one that was able to step up to the plate and provide their batteries. And I wonder if there is, from your perspective, if there is any rationale behind the European refusal to provide them to Ukraine. I find it quite hard to understand why no one is willing to provide even a single battery when it could do so much in Ukraine while right now it's sitting in a warehouse.
Well, they're not sitting in warehouses necessarily, but I agree that some countries have air and missile defense capabilities that are not likely to be used anytime soon, and that they should provide. The U.S. has only one battalion of Patriot in Europe total. We've always been way too short, and that battalion is typically being employed around in Poland now to protect the equipment transfer site already. But there are other Patriots that the U.S. has that I think should be sent there, prioritized to Ukraine versus somewhere in the Middle East, where we also have strategic interests, and there is a daily threat from Iranian missiles or their proxies. Still, this goes to what is the strategic outcome we want in Ukraine, and where is our priority. I did see today that the United States is going to send another Patriot, some systems, I don't know how many, and the United States is also calling on other countries to provide Patriot. But Patriot is not the only thing. I mean, you can help educate your listeners. When we talk about air and missile defense, you've got to be able to knock down incoming missiles and drones and rockets and aircraft at different altitudes, different. You need you need a layered system of air and missile defense. It's not just having Patriots there. I think that when the F-16s finally do arrive, they will probably help be a part of this integrated air and missile defense system. But I would say it actually is better if you can kill the archer rather than just trying to knock down or intercept all of his arrows. In other words, the ability to hit places from which Russian air and missile attacks originate, whether that's an air base or missile launch sites or drone launch sites. Many of these are in Russian occupied Ukraine, such as in Crimea. Give Ukraine the ability to hit those places. It's much better to destroy that than try to intercept drones and missiles that are already in the air.
And I guess because of that, it's really good news that Ukraine now has the ATACMS and it's able to target Crimea, which apparently it wasn't able to do before. And that, I think, gives me a good segue to talk about Crimea, since I think it's quite clear from your writing and from your public appearances that you see Crimea as absolutely crucial for the future development of the war. And last year, you wrote in your essay that liberating Crimea changes everything. Can you explain why is Crimea so important, and how actually would it change things if it were to be liberated?
Of course, Ukraine has had the ability to target Crimea with the British Storm Shadow and the French Scout. They've already proven the concept that they can make Crimea untenable with just 3 Storm Shadows and some special operators and some drones, where they destroyed Russian maintenance and Russian headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. And so the Black Sea Fleet is already in the process of withdrawing back to Novorossiysk. So the concept has been proven. Now, as you correctly point out with ATACMS, they have a lot more capability to hit targets all over Crimea. And we're seeing that happening now at Jankoy, which is a large logistics and aviation site in the northern part of Crimea. There is no place to hide. I mean, given the size of Crimea, the fact that every Ukrainian knows every square meter of Crimea, there's nowhere to hide. But now you can reach it with quantity of capabilities. So I suspect that they will be doing that a lot. The significance of Crimea is the reason that Catherine the Great took it back at the end of the 18th century. From Crimea, you can dominate the entire Black Sea, which has always been the objective of the Russians ever since Catherine. Um, if you control Crimea, not only do you have the best port in the Black Sea, Sevastopol, but you can reach out with anti-ship missiles. You can launch airstrikes, drone strikes. disrupt all of the commercial traffic in the Black Sea. You can hit NATO countries like Romania and Bulgaria, as well as Turkey. So Crimea is very important. On the Ukrainian side, and so by the way, Putin has put his personal prestige on Crimea. I mean, they have celebrated that, and so it would be a significant blow to the Russian side. It will be a significant blow to the Russian side when they are finally ejected from that place. That big bridge, that thing is going to drop at some point, not with ATACMS, but I think Ukrainians will have a plan that will bring that bridge down, make it unusable as part of the isolation of the Crimean Peninsula. Now, for the Ukrainians, Crimea is important because of the again what it offers in terms of defense and access to the Black Sea. But for the reconstruction of Crimea, if Russia still sits in Crimea, that means that they will block access in and out of Azov Sea, and two of Ukraine's five major pre-war seaports, Mariupol and Berdansk, are on Azov Sea. So they'll never be able to get those ports back in operation again and use them as long as Russia occupies Crimea. Plus, their main ports of Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kherson will always be easily interdictable or disrupted by the Russians if the Russians are in Crimea. So Ukraine's future, the rebuilding of their economy, depends on the liberation of Crimea. Major investors, I'm talking about the multi-billion-dollar investment organizations, will not invest in Ukraine's reconstruction as long as they see the potential for resumption of hostilities. So I think for the long term, it's in Ukraine's economic interest that Crimea returns to Ukrainian control. And by the way, this war is about respect for the so called international rules based order, which means respect for sovereignty. And even the Russians had agreed multiple times that Crimea was Ukraine.
You've mentioned many times before that, we're close to making, or Ukraine is close to making Crimea untenable. And it does look at the moment increasingly like Ukraine will be able to making Crimea isolated. But then I think if we look past that, liberation is something different. And that would probably require deployment of ground troops and something that would look probably, I imagine, like a very very ambitious amphibious operation. So if we look at that next step beyond isolating Crimea, what kind of resources would Ukraine need to pull something like that off, and what would that actually look like?
So, excellent point. Um, I think the actual ultimate liberation of Crimea will take time. I mean, over the centuries, it has been difficult to assault. Uh, and so I think the priority is first get the Russian military out of there where they cannot use it. That will be that in my view would be the priority. Isolate it and make it untenable. And then as resources become available when the timing is right, and I think through a variety of means, Ukraine will figure out a way to do that with whether it's special forces, amphibious forces, a whole variety of different capabilities. Um, I think it will happen when it's time. First, make it so that Russia cannot use it.
It seems like there's a bit of a, from the Western perspective, there's a bit of a difference between rest of occupied Ukraine and Crimea. And there's often this argument that uh, if Ukraine were to attempt to retake Crimea, it could either force Putin to, go nuclear, or that if it was successful, it could lead to a regime downfall in Russia because Crimea is so important for Putin and his public appearance, which some say is not desirable for the West and would be too risky. So sometimes I feel like there is not much of a public support in some Western circles for Ukraine to focus on liberating Crimea. I wonder, what do you think of those arguments if you're reading it that way as well?
All right. So I've heard those things before. Let me ask you, Dominic, why, first of all, why is it a bad thing that the continuing collapse of the Russian Empire would be accelerated by uh, the Putin regime falling and in the loss due to the loss of Crimea? What, number one, why is that a bad thing? When people say, "Oh my God, we don't want to do that," like, okay, why not? I mean, why is that a bad thing? Russia will never be a normal country until they are forced or they are freed from this empire led that benefits only a very small number of people. That would be my first question to somebody that says that. Number two, what do you mean when you say go nuclear? I mean, I think I sort of know what you mean when you say that, but I mean, now we're talking about policy. We're talking about strategic thinking, decisions, and policy. And to say, well, we can't do this because they might go nuclear. Okay, well, tell me what you mean by go nuclear. Use what will they do? I mean, use a nuclear. It's not. These are not trick questions of you. I'm not trying to stump you, but this is how you publicly have to think about these debates about, oh, what should we do? And of course, Russia has successfully put in the minds of too many people that they might go nuclear without ever saying what that really means. So let's unpack this. I mean, first of all, um, as you know, and many of your listeners probably know, there are different types of nuclear weapons. You have strategic nuclear weapons, the big ones that come out of silos that are targeting Washington D.C. or New York or Chicago or places like that in the U.S. that have existed since the Cold War. Just like we have those strategic nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles that can be launched from silos, but also from bombers or submarines, what we call the nuclear triad. And the whole strategic balance was based on the ability of mutually assured destruction. If Russia ever launched a nuclear strike, we would have enough that would survive that would go back, and the Russians believed that. So that's why for 70 years, well, since we both had nuclear weapons, we've never used them against each other. And then you have a much lower level. And by the way, that people think about nuclear, they think Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or the movie Doctor Strangelove, where the whole world ends up in a nuclear holocaust. But then you have tactical nuclear weapons, which are much smaller, lower yield weapons. They're still nuclear weapons, but nonetheless a significantly smaller yield that were developed in the Cold War by Soviet forces to destroy a portion of NATO defenses. Somewhere in the in NATO lines in West Germany, for example, where you could then blow a hole in those defenses, and then you had Soviet forces, Warsaw Pact forces, and the Czechs were among the Czechoslovakians at the time were among the best in terms of being able to operate in a nuclear radioactive environment. They had the right equipment, they had vehicles that could operate there, and they had practiced being able to exploit that. So that's why they had these tactical nuclear weapons. But with a tactical nuclear weapon, the yield is so low you could detonate one at the far end of the runway of the airport in Prague, and it would not necessarily blow all the glass out of the terminal. I mean, it's a different kind of thing. So you have to think about. So Russia could go nuclear. How would they use an ICBM, a strategic missile, against the United States because Russia was about to lose Crimea? I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. I mean, that would guarantee Putin's death, along with hundreds of thousands of other people. So that doesn't make any sense to me. On a tactical level, where is that place in Ukraine? Let's assume it would be in Ukraine that he would use a tactical nuclear weapon to achieve what? I mean, because there are no Russian troops that have the equipment and capability to exploit the gap the way Warsaw Pact did have it back in the Cold War. So, so there's no practical reason to do it. It's only the threat of doing it that gives them an advantage because they see that we deter ourselves. that we stop, oh my God, they might go nuclear. But when you start thinking practically about it, and then I have to say, for the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, there's a lot of people that would be involved in that. And we would see it coming also, by the way. I mean, you got to get these weapons out of the depots. You've got to do a lot of things. You've got to marry it up with the launch vehicle, whatever it is. These are not something that in a couple of minutes come out of a silo somewhere. And I'm not entirely sure that every single Russian officer in the chain will do what they have to do. I don't know that, but that to me is a vulnerability. And then finally, my president has said catastrophic consequences of Russia if you use any nuclear weapon, catastrophic consequences. And even the Chinese have told the Russians, do not do it. I think it's extremely unlikely because there's zero benefit. There's no positive outcome for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon.
I think I have to say I do agree with you, but to play the devil's advocate, and I think this is an interesting and important conversation to have. So to answer your questions, first, I think on whether it's a bad thing if the Russian regime would fall because of losing Crimea. I've heard arguments that it's, on one hand, it's better to have the evil that you know rather than someone who might replace Putin, who might potentially be a worse option for the West. And then you also have the issue of if you're risking, collapse of a regime in Russia, what happens to the nuclear weapons that Russia has, and that could potentially be a risk. And on your second question, wouldn't it be possible, or wouldn't it be a theoretical option for Russia to launch or threaten launching a tactical nuclear weapon on Kiev if it looked like they were about to be pushed out of Crimea completely?
Okay, so to the risks of the collapse of the regime, first of all, I have a hard time imagining somebody that'd be worse than Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's been in power now for almost more than 20 years. Um, he has been directly responsible for the death of tens of thousands of people, not only in Ukraine but in other places. And let's say he does fall, is replaced, whatever happens. Whoever comes after him is going to inherit a military that is in tatters, a country that has pretty much been isolated by all of the Western world. And Russia is a big, gigantic gas station for China, selling oil and gas to China for much reduced prices than what Russia used to get. So, um, whoever comes next, what are they going to do that's worse than Vladimir Putin? That's, I think, you could argue different ways about that, but as I look at it, hard to imagine a worse for the rest of us, a worse person than Vladimir Putin. Um, Loss of control of nuclear weapons that didn't happen when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, nothing. And in fact, I would advocate that we should be preparing, thinking, planning for what happens if. I'm not in favor of purposely creating regime change. We have a bad record of that ourselves, of when we've tried it in the past. Um, but we would be foolish not to plan for what might happen. What happens to those nuclear weapons? What about the hundreds of billions of dollars of assets that are stored in different places around the world that only benefit only a very small number of people, but that would be necessary for reconstruction of Ukraine, reconstruction of Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, control of the oil and gas infrastructure. Nothing happened to that at the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'm skeptical that somehow it would just all go into total chaos at the collapse of the current uh, regime of the Russian Federation. Now, the possibility of using a nuclear weapon against Kiev, yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely a possibility. But the Ukrainians have said, what else are you going to do? I mean, you're launching multi-million dollar missiles against us already, killing innocent people. So for the Ukrainians, I don't see this as a deterrent. And again, President Xi, President Biden have both told the Russians do not use a nuclear weapon anywhere. So I think Russia would get no benefit out of a nuclear strike of some size in Kyiv.
So I think moving away from Crimea, I want to talk about one more thing, and that's in July last year, you wrote in the Daily Telegraph in your op-ed that Biden must get NATO ready for imminent war despite Russian failure in Ukraine. The clock is ticking, and time is not in favor of the transatlantic alliance. And I wanted to dig a little deeper in that. I guess from the article. Do you think that Russia has made a decision to expand the war further is one question. And do you think that we're ready for this um, if we're ready for an imminent war more than when you wrote the article, which was roughly a year ago?
So thank you for bringing that up. We have moved way too slow on re-energizing our industrial base. Now, the West has enormous potential industrial capacity. If you add together the economies of all the EU plus US, UK, Canada, it dwarfs whatever Russia has. But we still somehow have not mustered the political will required to create those resources that would be needed for effective deterrence or effective defense. So I'm still very concerned there. I do believe that the alliance has done very well on improving command structures. On now that we have war plans that are approved by the North Atlantic Council, these are the kind of things that needed to be done to improve readiness in the alliance. We still do not have enough air and missile defense, and clearly the Russians, if they've made the terrible decision to attack a NATO country, then they will have also already made the terrible decision to launch missiles against civilian infrastructure. And I worry that we do not have enough based on what we see happening in Ukraine on a daily basis. We also still do not have the ability to move as fast as we need to before the crisis in order to prevent the crisis, what we refer to as military mobility. This is still a challenge. And then finally, our societies are still in disbelief. I mean, the further west you go, people are like, "What? That's why? Why would Russia attack?" Okay, just like people were saying, "Why would Russia attack Ukraine?" It makes no sense. So you can't think like an American or a German or a Brit. You have to think like a Russian. You know, and then ask that question. So getting our societies ready, having the resilience to not be vulnerable to disinformation, for example, for our infrastructure to be protected from cyber attacks, which absolutely will be part of any sort of Russian effort. Disinformation to create labor unrest so that host nation support is not as reliable to do all the things necessary. These are the things. These are the areas where I know your president worked very hard when he was at NATO, and he's still working hard to improve inside the Czech Republic. But this is true across all of our countries, and I think the decision for Russia will be based on if Ukraine fails, and the only reason Ukraine fails is if the West does not help them win. That's the only reason Ukraine will fail is because we fail. And if we fail there, then I think Russia will feel emboldened that, like, okay, the West still doesn't get it, and then I think after I don't know 2 3 years, Russia will be ready to go again, and they talk about it openly. I mean, this is not like a secret. They talk openly about it, and Romania has said they will not. Romania has indicated that they will help protect Moldova. I'm sure that Poland will not just sit there behind their border and watch Russian forces just keep moving across Ukraine. So, if we want to avoid a situation where Russia actually gets into a war with NATO, we help Ukraine defeat Russia in Ukraine. That's the best way to make sure that Czech soldiers are not in a conflict as part of NATO with Russia, is by defeating Russia in Ukraine.
I think that's a great way to end on this note and on this message. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed the discussion. I think it's good to put in a little more disagreements, because it's always better in discussions when people disagree with each other rather than agree all the time.
Well, Dominic, you're a great host. You asked hard questions, and I liked the style of your podcast. So thank you for the privilege you gave me.